It is my great pleasure to welcome Sally Perkins to our pulpit today. She's no stranger to this pulpit, as most of you know. But I am going to tell you just a little bit of story because it feels like for me personally, this is coming full circle. I went to a workshop about 15 years ago that the Storytelling Arts of Indiana, I think is the name of the organization, was putting on to help encourage representatives of different organizations learn how to conjure up and present their stories. And during the workshop, those of us who were in attendance went around and said a little bit about the organizations we were with. And anyway, so a little bit about the organizations we were with. And my sharing was about OUCC. And after the program, Sally came up to me and expressed an interest in maybe joining us for service occasionally to tell stories. And we've been listening to her stories ever since. But today we get to listen to a little bit more in addition, because she finally wrote a book about what it is and how it's done to help the rest of us understand better. And she's going to talk a little bit about that. But she is a trainer and a consultant specializing in strategic storytelling for persuasive communication. She serves as an insight data storyteller for Authentics, an Indianapolis-based tech company. She has a PhD in rhetorical studies, but she finds her most meaningful work is in helping formerly incarcerated and unhoused individuals tell their powerful stories of restoration and healing. So I would welcome Sally, help me welcome Sally to our pulpit, and we'll get technology transferred over. Oops.
Nope. Okay. Take that apart.
Where'd you go? There.
Pocket.
All right, I got you fired up and going, but I'm not sure that this thing is working. So
A different button.
you can fumble with the technology.
It's so good to be with you again, always, and I love the fact that every time I come, there are new faces in the seat here. And we are going to go in a very different direction this morning because my work has, as Tom mentioned, begun to unfold. I'm still doing stories, I'm still sharing them. I promise you I'll come back and we'll go into deep stories, but we're going to zoom out today and look a little bit more at the power of stories for advocacy. And I am excited to share that with you because I know you are a group of people who believe in and are actively engaged in the work of advocacy, which we need now more than ever before. Before we start, I want to share, we'll go into a moment of meditation and then we'll go into what we're sharing for today. About 20 years ago, I started as a volunteer at Riley Children's Hospital, telling stories at the bedsides of children. Once a month, my storytelling partners and I would go into the rooms of the kids at Riley to tell stories. After I'd been doing this for about 2 years, I began to wonder whether I should continue the effort. And I was wondering that because my own kids were small at the time. I wasn't sure if I wanted one more night away from them at home. And I began to wonder because often we would go into maybe 10, 15 rooms at Riley and walk away having told 2 stories. Because as you can imagine, kids were either heavily medicated or simply not feeling well enough or asleep Or they might be feeling pretty good and have a brother or sister in the room bouncing around with them. Or more often than not, they were more intrigued with the big black screen that is strategically located from their line of sight. And when we would say, do you want to hear a story? They would say, no, because I'm watching the screen. So I started to second guess my volunteer effort. But then one night, my storytelling partner and I walked into the room of a little girl who was about 9 years old. She was clearly in pain. She was audibly moaning, holding her abdomen. So we weren't sure that she was up for a story. But we also happened to notice that her mother, who was in the room with her, was not at her side giving comfort to her daughter. Her mother was flitting around the room, cleaning papers up and straightening up the room. And we quickly realized this was not because the mother didn't love the daughter. It was because that little girl's pain was that family's normal. So my storytelling partner and I decided that we should perhaps see if she might be up for a story. She had by her bedside on her tray a little pipe cleaner, butterfly, and flower. So we picked those objects up. We played with them for just a moment to gauge her response, and she seemed okay with that. So we decided this is why we were here, to tell a story. We'll just try something very simple. And we told her the story of the 3 pigs. By the time the second pig was building the house of, do you remember? Very good, Tom, you win the prize, sticks. By the time the second pig was building the house of sticks, her moaning stopped. So we carried on, and you know how the story goes. The big bad wolf came into the story. Her eyes got bigger and bigger. The corner of her mouth went up just a little bit. We carried on. We had that wolf go up the chimney and down, or up the roof, down the chimney. We put an imaginary lid on the pot. The story ended. Then we picked up the pipe cleaner, butterfly, and flower again, played with those for just a few moments. And I kid you not, 15 seconds after the story ended, her moaning started again. I walked out of the room that night and knew 2 things to be true. Number 1, I should probably continue volunteering to tell stories at the bedsides of the kids. And number 2, I walked out of the room that night knowing that something incredibly powerful happens when humans encounter a story. So today we're going to explore a little bit about what happens when humans encounter a story and how we can use storytelling to advance the causes that we believe advance truth and justice. So I invite you to close your eyes for just a couple of moments and take just a moment of silence to consider with gratitude the stories of religious and spiritual traditions that have shaped and guided you. May we reflect this day on how our stories can be used for good or for ill. And may we be guided to tell stories as best we can to advance only that which is good and right, just and true. Amen. I am going to see if I can move that. I don't know if I can. We'll keep it there. It's all right. All right. A few years ago, in the month of March, I know we're in football season right now, but go spin with me to March. In the month of, when March Madness is happening. Well, that's perfect. Thank you. I opened up my email one day and this is what I saw in my email. I see a brackets for good. Have you seen that sort of thing where you get this, right? And then you have to vote for the charity of your choice. And there are several rounds, just as there are with the NCAA tournament, until finally there's a winner. This is a cruel thing that people are asking us to do, right? You have to vote for the charity of your choice. And of course, they are all of equal value. But as I sat and looked at the list, deciding where I was going to cast my vote, a few things did stand out to me. So the first that stood out was, you're right, Tom. All right. What is it that I hit if I'm going to use the, that didn't work either. Oh, there we go. Click on the screen. That's what you said. That can happen. All right, so Riley Children's Hospital was on the list. Imagine. Also on the list was Tails and Trails. That stood out to me because it was a pet adoption agency. My husband and I had recently adopted a poodle. So I thought, well, there's a worthy cause. And Central Avenue Christian Church downtown has done a lot of work. I worked with them recently on supporting the unhoused community downtown. And so those stood out to me. But of course, as I looked at this list, the thing that jumped out the most was Riley Children's Hospital. And you can imagine it's because of that story that lingered with me. A story not only that I experienced, but a story that I tell a lot. And so it's what came to the forefront of my mind. And consequently, Riley won my vote. But all things equal, if we had just the data on all of these organizations in front of us, it would be very hard to decide, would it not, as to which of these is more meritorious of our vote than another. So, as I mentioned, when I walked out of the room that night at the Children's Hospital, I knew something powerful happens when humans encounter a story. But years later, in my work in storytelling, I came to understand what happens in the minds of people when they encounter a story from neuroscience. So I want to share some of that neuroscience with you today because it's utterly fascinating and so important. Because if we want to move people toward a cause that we consider to be just and right and true and good, storytelling is essential. And you'll learn a little bit about how that works with the brain. It's not going to be, there's no test. This is going to be simple. We're going to move fast through this, but you're going to find it fascinating. We'll talk a little bit about the fact that not everything is a story. How do you know you're telling a story to advance a cause? And a couple of story scopes that I have written about in my book. And specifically, I want you to be thinking about what you're doing in the coming days, advancing the cause of Oak Landon Unitarian Universalist Church as you celebrate your 150th anniversary and as you are growing and impacting your community, you have the opportunity to use storytelling as part of that effort. So that's how I want you to make connections as we move through this quickly today. Why do stories really matter? Your brain on stories. I'm going to back up for just a minute and talk about a communication author who is not a neuroscientist. His name is Granville Toogood. And Granville Toogood said, many years before the neuroscience research on this, he said that whenever we are talking with another person, so I want you to imagine that you are talking or writing to a legislator, or you're talking to someone about this church or any other subject that you care about. Granville Toogood said, whenever you're talking to another human being, you are activating one of two parts of their mind. Now, he's not a neuroscientist, so take this with a grain of salt, but I'll show you the neuroscience in a moment. He said you might be activating what he calls the conscious mind. This is the part of us that processes data, information, bullet points, facts, budgets, reports. And all of that is necessary if we're going to advance a cause. People need to receive that kind of information from us. And that is part of persuading them. We have to activate their conscious mind. Case in point, I was recently working, I've done a lot of work with vaccination advocacy groups as of late. And I was working with some at a conference recently of vaccination advocates, and we were talking about the kind of information they have to present in order to persuade people to get vaccinated, as well as legislation around it. You can imagine they have to activate the conscious mind. And in fact, if you go to the CDC website, don't read this. This is about measles. Here's what you see on the CDC website. All kinds of bullet points of information and all kinds of data points of information about the MMR vaccine. Is that necessary in order to advocate for measles vaccinations? Yes, of course it is. That's great, but here's what we've learned from neuroscience, is that activating the conscious mind, as Granville Toogood would say, which is data and bullet points of information, only engage these three areas of the brain. The Broca's area and the Wernicke's area are the language centers of the brain. No quiz, no test, just information. And the prefrontal cortex is what we associate with the higher order brain, the executive function of the brain. This is good, right? But here's the problem. Anytime we're trying to advocate for something like measles vaccination requirements, we've got competition. Let's say you're wanting to parent a child to get vaccinated and they're thinking about, oh yeah, but I also have to take care of my kids' asthma problems. And we've got camp this summer and the teacher's telling me to read to them, and there's other data, and there's data that suggests that people saying that their children have problems because of vaccines and it causes autism. And there's all kinds of stuff on social media. Am I right? All kinds of competition. Even when you're trying to advance the cause of this church, you're faced with all kinds of competition. And yet you're down here saying, get your shots. Or there's all kinds of other good nonprofit organizations that deserve our money, and you're saying, or us too, pay attention to what we're doing as well. So we're wanting to get people to attend to what we're interested in advancing. We want them to prioritize it. We want to motivate them to actually take action. And we want them to remember what we're trying to convey. In fact, we were just talking about writing letters to our legislators to advance a cause. And we want all of these things. We want that letter to get people's attention. We want that letter to help our legislator prioritize or motivate or remember what we're saying. So what we have learned is that the conscious mind alone doesn't do it. Granville Toogood, again, not the neuroscientist, had a good hunch about this about 20 years ago. And he said, not only do we need to activate their conscious mind, but we also need to activate what he calls the primal mind. Why does this man have a lizard head? Because the primal mind is loosely, for this non-neuroscientist, was referring to the more reptilian part of the human brain. The part of us that moves or takes action because of strong likes or dislikes or instincts, fear, maybe hunger, whatever it might be. And Granville Toogood said that if we want to move people to take action, we have to activate both parts of the mind. How do we do that? How do we activate the primal mind? He said, number one, you got to be likable. So when you write a letter to your legislator, I don't know if you're like me, but it's big. Look at Sherry. She just grimaced. I wish you could have seen her face just now. Because if you're like me, when you're writing a letter to the legislator, you're just, right? It's really hard to be likable when you're doing that. And yet that is a part of activating the primal mind. I'm not really an expert on likability, by the way. And if you're struggling with that, I don't know, therapy might be your best bet. I just am not the expert. But the other thing that he tells us is that telling stories activates the primal mind. So, case in point, I was working with a group of physicians who were all trying to get their patients to get vaccinated recently. And we talked about this particular story about a little boy back in 2017 who was on his family farm. He was out in the barn, fell, cut open his forehead. He had not been vaccinated. His family did not believe in vaccinations. And his family, in fact, believed that they could take care of the cut. So they did the sutures themselves. Within about 24 hours, he was showing symptoms of tetanus. Now, this is fascinating because tetanus is so rare these days that hospitals are not even prepared for it because they don't see this very often. But by the time he went to the hospital, he then had to be lifelined to a place that could care for him, where he was experiencing all the symptoms of tetanus: lockjaw, muscle spasms. His back was spasming back and forth. He could not experience light or sound because any stimulation caused his muscles to contract. He was in the hospital for 54 days. 47 of which he was in ICU. He then was in rehab for 17 more days. And his parents still chose not to get him vaccinated, at the cost of over $180,000. I shared that story with our group of physicians. And one of the physicians said, you know what? I've got a patient who I've really been struggling to convince him to get vaccinated. And a week later, I got an email from that doctor saying, I told the story and he got the shot. Now, I am not suggesting that a story is a silver bullet. It is not magic. It is not a guarantee. But what we do know is that when the brain encounters a story, something different happens. And this is what neuroscience has discovered in the last 10 to 15 years. Bear with me through a little more brain research because it's just fascinating. When I told you that story, and when I told you the story of the little girl in Riley Children's Hospital, several things were happening. Not only were these parts of your brain engaged, but also your motor cortex. You can't see that on the left, and on the right, it's your sensory cortex. So when you saw me pick up that pipe cleaner butterfly and flower, do you remember that? Oh, yes, you do, I'm sure. Your motor cortex was engaged. You weren't even there. You're not even moving, but your motor cortex was engaged. And when I said that her moaning stopped, your sensory cortex was engaged at that point. That meant also that your limbic system, which is deep in your brain, was also engaged. Your hypothalamus got engaged because cortisol, and it triggered the release of cortisol. Cortisol is the chemical that gets released when we lose our keys. And you know how when you lose your keys, you can't think of anything else until you find them, right? You can't think about your dishwasher needing to be repaired or whatever it is, right? You're focused. Cortisol focuses us, which is what's happening when people encounter a story. They're focused. And oxytocin is released, that hormone that causes us to care. And down there at the bottom, the amygdala gets activated, which processes and stores our memories, which is why we remember a story when we don't remember the facts. Neurotransmitters also get involved, releasing dopamine, which is our motivator as well. Okay, no quiz. Aren't you glad? You don't have to remember this. But what I want you to know is that all of these parts of the brain, do you see how more active the brain is when you're engaged in a story? And here's the fabulous thing, is that neuroscientists used to think that when people were making decisions, like whether or not to support what your cause is, that they were only using the higher order prefrontal cortex of the brain. And they've been studying this for about the last decade, and they've discovered that the same areas of the brain that are engaged when people are making decisions are what are engaged when you're telling a story. And furthermore, just to add to it, what they discovered is that the brain of the story receiver syncs with the brain of the storyteller. So we have so much more of a chance of advancing our cause when people encounter a story. How are you doing? Are you with me? It's kind of fascinating, isn't it? Yes. Again, it's not magic. Please understand. But we can't afford not to tell stories when we are wanting to advance a cause. But not everything is a story. We often say, I'm using a story, or, oh, we got to get better at telling our story. I hear that all the time, and that's why people ask me to come and help them do their work in a lot of different settings. Very quickly, this says chapters. That's only because I wrote a book. I'm not going to get here. Don't worry. We're not going to go on too long. We'll zip through this. But when you share the data, right? Some people think, oh, I've got a story. It's just organized information. So data alone is not a story. Additionally, if I was to give a testimonial, this one is about somebody on some website said, the entire Omnia Amelia Island staff. Omnia Amelia Island is a resort with a big conference center. And this was on their website. Somebody was saying they were extremely accommodating and they went out of their way to ensure that we had a great event. Omnia Amelia Island has demonstrated they are willing to help us create value for our clients, leading to our mutual success. We look forward to partnering with Omnia Amelia Island for future events. That is great, right? And exactly what you want on your website. You can imagine such a statement about Oaklandon UC, right? You can imagine a statement like that. It's great, but it's a testimonial, not a story. Important distinction. The last thing is that a chronology of events is not a story. Does that look familiar to you? Now, this is the good news, is that you have a story on your website. But I did look at your website the other day, and you do have this beautiful chronology. I'm not saying the chronology shouldn't be there. It should absolutely be there. It's just important to note that it is a chronology and not a story. Are you with me? It activates the conscious mind, not the primal mind. So how do we know we're in a story? We know we're in a story when what we're sharing follows this story loop. Stories have 4 components to them. They start with normal. Once upon a time, in a land far away, there was a king, a queen, and a princess. Every day, the king, the queen, and the princess went to the pond. Normal. Nothing's wrong. Normal. But stories start out with normal. They're only interesting, however, if there is an uh-oh. If I had told you that I go to the hospital, I started going to the hospital 20 years ago, volunteering, you were probably like maybe moderately engaged at that point. But then I said, but then one night, I walked into the room of a little girl about 9 years old. She was audibly moaning. Are you with me on this? Uh-oh. And likely you were more engaged at that moment. The story gets worse and worse and worse. I have to tell you, I came in this morning and Tom told me the story of his broken leg. He did a beautiful job, right? It started with normal. I was out in the woods and I was taking care of the trees. Normal for Tom. And then he tells me about the tree falling. And notice that I love this shape of the uh-oh because it got worse. The tree fell. And then the tree fell again. I'm not telling it well, Tom, but right then something else happened in it. And again, we had another breakage. And then you see how it gets worse and worse. Then the tree is rolling toward him and then it breaks his leg. And then he tries to crawl onto the truck and then he stands on it. Oh, and it got worse. And then, right, you see the uh-oh gets worse and worse. I was completely engaged in his story. But then the stories have to have a turning point, right? Something, and it could be that the turning point is something that's already happened, or it could be something that we want to have happen. And then our story works best, if you can't see this, but new normal. We have to have a new normal. The new normal for Tom is that he's walking again and he's back and he's stronger than ever with a little bit of pain. He might argue that, but he's back and he's with us, right? A new normal. Or it could be we're advocating for something and we're not at the new normal. We want to advocate for the intervention, but we want to cast a vision of what we want the new normal to be. Are you with me? Okay, are you bored? You can say yes. All right, okay, I'm going to be quick. The last thing I want to talk about is story scoping. We're already to the end. And what this suggests, what I've learned in working with all kinds of advocacy groups over the years, is that there are two types of stories that we need to be strategic about thinking how and what we want to tell. So those two types of stories are what I have come to define and describe as tree tales and forest stories. What is the difference? A tree tale is a story that zooms in and is about specific people at particular points in time having very specific events happen to them. You've heard 3 tree tales already in the last few minutes. My experience in the hospital, you heard the tree tale of the little boy who fell and cut his head, and you heard the tree tale about Tom. A forest story zooms out and it tells the larger story of an aggregate of people over a longer period of time. But the key is that both the tree tale and the forest story must follow the story loop structure. I'll give you a quick example. I used that story loop structure in the story I told you about Riley, right? Normal. I started telling stories back in 2006, and each month we would. Normal, you were moderately engaged. And then I started to wonder whether it was worth it, a little bit of suspense. And then, so we walk into the room of the little girl, like this is kind of an intervention toward my wondering whether I should do it. But we go back to the, she's not up for story. She doesn't feel good. We tell her the story, The Three Pigs, and the new normal, I walk out and I know 2 things to be true. A very tightly constructed story. In fact, I've learned to tell, it's all true, but I've learned to tell the story in that structure because I know that's what's going to be most engaging as I share it with people. But if your audience wants the data, they need a forest story. So a vaccination forest story might look like, well, I don't know if I want to give you that one. Let's do this one. Do you see yourselves up there? I looked at your website, and the beautiful thing is that in addition to that timeline, you have the beginnings of a story in there on another part of the website. Normal. From 1838 to 1875, a new congregation is founded and it builds its first building. That's how your story starts. Normal, especially for that time, right? It got interesting because you mentioned tragedy. So between 1920 and 1925, there's tragedy from a fire. And then we have even more tragedy, a second tragic fire, and the congregation builds its 3rd brick church building. And then I noticed kind of buried within there, there's also the decline in the community, the economic decline and the change in the community, all of which are the of the story. We get a little sense in the story of what the intervention was. I read a little bit about business and community support. And then, buried in there is a little bit about the new normal of where we are today. You see how this takes the chronology of events and it turns it into a story. And there may be more opportunity to use this story loop to even more strategically think when you have a moment to talk to somebody about the work of this church, what's the framework that you want to use? What are the key elements that you most want to use to share with them? Here's what I also found beautiful about the website is that what works best is when we combine tree tales, and forest stories. So it could be that in this loop, there's a place to weave in a tree tale, to get specific about somebody in this church or in the community who was very specifically helped through a moment in need. So we zoom out to talk about the aggregate of the community and the church, but there might be a strategic moment to zoom in and say, let me tell you how it changed me to be a member of this community. Our brain on stories, especially when we're able to weave together tree tales and forest stories, and we make that decision based on what our audience needs. If we're writing to our legislators, we probably need a forest story that weaves in a tree tale. We need to structure what we write to our legislators in the format of a story to draw them in, to compel them. And we can do it in a few sentences. But if we think about this structure, we can be even more persuasive. That's the fast version of the book. In fact, I have brought copies with me for you today. If you're interested, we can talk about that in the back. I can offer copies for you to purchase, but less important to me than that is this. Our faith traditions have been founded on stories. So we know the importance of stories, but we also know that stories can be used for ill as well as good. And if that's true, it is all the more important for us to be conscientious about how we're telling our stories so that we are as compelling as possible when we're advancing our cause toward what is right and true and just and fair as those who are telling a story on the other side. So may you find some utility in what we've done here today, as well as inspiration, as you, I know, are people who continue to advocate for that which matters most. Amen.
Myself, so thank you. With some closing words. And then, y'all, are you gonna be downstairs at all? You wanna?
Yeah, I forgot. Till 12. I have to leave at 12. But
Okay, because that's usually where we do the books, if that's easier for you
Absolutely.
or acceptable to you.
Yeah.
All right. So we will have refreshments downstairs after the service if you'd like to join us. But before that, I have some closing words. You are in the story of the world. You are the world coming to know itself. May you trust that all you will ever say or do belongs in the story of the world.